The year is 180 AD. The Roman Empire stands at the pinnacle of its power, yet within its gilded walls, a terrifying drama is unfolding. Millions around the world know the heroic tale of Maximus, Decimus, Meridius, the betrayed general turned gladiator, seeking vengeance against the mad Emperor Commodus. It is a story of honor, sacrifice, and the ultimate triumph of justice, beautifully told in the Oscar-winning film Gladiator. But what if I told you that the real history was far, far stranger, more depraved, more politically complex, and in many ways, infinitely more brutal than anything Hollywood dared to show? This Anatomy of Dread documentary will conduct a deep psychological autopsy on the true story that inspired the legend. We will peel back the layers of cinematic heroism to uncover the real Emperor Commodus, a man whose narcissism and bloodlust made him one of Rome's most terrifying rulers. We will descend into the real Roman Colosseum, not as a stage for noble vengeance, but as a chilling arena where death was the ultimate entertainment, and the psychology of power consumed both emperor and commoner. Forget the cinematic hero. It is time to meet the real monsters of Rome. It is time to uncover a truth that was simply too brutal for Hollywood. Our story begins not with a gladiator, but with a golden age, and its abrupt, terrifying end. The movie Gladiator opens with the wise and revered Emperor Marcus Aurelius, a philosopher king who dreams of restoring the Roman Republic. This much, at least, is rooted in truth. Marcus Aurelius was indeed one of the 5 good emperors, renowned for his wisdom, his stoic philosophy, and his efforts to rule justly. He was a man who truly valued peace and reason. However, the movie takes a dramatic leap with his death. In the film, Marcus Aurelius is secretly murdered by his ambitious son, Commodus, who then usurps power, betraying his father's dream. The truth, as often happens, is more mundane, yet in its own way, more profoundly tragic. Marcus Aurelius most likely died of natural causes, succumbing to an illness while campaigning in Vindobona, modern-day Vienna. There is no historical evidence to suggest Commodus murdered him, but the tragedy lay in his succession. Marcus Aurelius made the fateful decision to break a century-long tradition of adopting a worthy successor, and instead appointed his biological son, Commodus, as emperor. From a psychological perspective, this was a catastrophic error. Marcus Aurelius, a man of immense self-control and intellectual discipline, seemed to have been blind to the true nature of his son. Commodus was the antithesis of his father. He was young, privileged, and deeply narcissistic. He had been raised with absolute power, and with it he developed an unchecked ego and a profound disdain for the responsibilities of leadership. The dread began not with a coup, but with the simple, horrifying fact that the most powerful man in the world was utterly unsuited for the job. The film hints at Commodus's instability, but the reality was far more disturbing. He possessed a level of self-obsession that would eventually descend into outright madness. The Senate, the army, the very fabric of Roman society all were at the mercy of a spoiled, insecure, and increasingly megalomaniacal young man who saw himself not as a ruler but as a living god. And it was this terrifying psychological unraveling that would ultimately lead him to the arena, not as an emperor but as a performer, plunging Rome into an era of unprecedented cruelty and bizarre self-indulgence. What began as a hopeful reign would quickly become a nightmare under the shadow of a truly deranged emperor. The movie Gladiator portrays Commodus as a jealous, power-hungry man, desperate for his father's approval. While traces of this insecurity existed, the real Emperor Commodus quickly surpassed mere ambition. His reign became a descent into a psychological abyss of unchecked narcissism and grandiosity that would define him as one of Rome's most notoriously bizarre rulers. From a psychological perspective, Commodus exhibited extreme traits of what we today might call narcissistic personality disorder, amplified by absolute power. He believed himself to be a living god, a reincarnation of Hercules. He ordered statues of himself to be erected throughout Rome, often depicted with Hercules's club and lion skin, his own face replacing that of the mythical hero. He even changed the names of the months to reflect his own titles and renamed Rome itself Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. This wasn't just vanity. It was a complete dissociation from reality, a terrifying belief in his own divine right to dictate every aspect of the world around him. His daily life became an elaborate theater of He surrounded himself with a rotating cast of favorites, who flattered his ego and enabled his increasingly erratic behavior. The Senate, once a powerful body, became a mere prop in his personal drama, forced to endure his bizarre pronouncements and public humiliations. Any perceived slight, any sign of disrespect, could be met with swift and brutal execution. The dread under Commodus was not just the fear of a tyrant, it was the fear of an unpredictable child, capable of unleashing terrifying violence on a whim. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Commodus's narcissism was his obsession with the arena. Unlike the movie, where he only enters the arena to challenge Maximus, the real Commodus saw himself as a magnificent gladiator, a peerless warrior. He would regularly don gladiatorial attire and fight in staged bouts within the Colosseum. He wasn't participating for sport, he was performing for adoration, carefully controlling the matches to ensure his victory over weaker, often wounded, opponents. He would even use a real sword against men armed with blunted weapons, always ensuring the crowd witnessed his superiority. His desire for glory in the arena overshadowed his duties as emperor. He neglected the affairs of state, leaving them to corrupt favorites, while he indulged in his bloody spectacles. This obsession wasn't just bizarre, it was sacrilegious. For an emperor, the highest office in Rome, to descend to the level of a gladiator class, seen as little more than slaves, was considered a profound disgrace and an insult to the dignity of the empire. This unprecedented behavior, this public display of psychological unraveling, created an atmosphere of fear and contempt among the Roman elite. They saw their emperor not as a divine leader, but as a dangerous madman. The empire was teetering on the brink, not from external enemies, but from the unchecked ego of the man who sat on its throne. The question wasn't if Commodus would fall, but when his bizarre and brutal reign would finally lead to his inevitable, violent end. The movie Gladiator presents the Colosseum as a stage for epic duels and a place where a hero like Maximus can fight for justice and freedom. While the spectacle of combat was certainly grand, the true Roman Colosseum was a place of organized, ritualized slaughter, far more brutal and psychologically chilling than anything Hollywood dared to portray. From a psychological perspective, the gladiatorial games were not just entertainment, they were a complex ritual designed to reinforce the power of the state, to desensitize the public to violence, and to remind every Roman of their place in a rigid social hierarchy. This was the ultimate theater of dread. First, let's understand the gladiators themselves. Most were not noble warriors fighting for vengeance, like Maximus. They were slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals. Some were free men who, through desperate poverty or reckless gambling, sold themselves into contracts with a Lanista gladiator trainer. Their lives were short, brutal, and utterly without dignity. They were trained to kill, but they were also trained to die. The battles themselves were rarely the heroic, drawn-out duels we see in films. While some fights were indeed skillful, many were fast, bloody affairs. The spectacle often began with animal hunts for nations, where thousands of exotic beasts, lions, tigers, bears, elephants were brutally slaughtered, often by professional hunters, not just gladiators. This served as a chilling warm-up for the main event, further desensitizing the crowd. The horror escalated with the execution of criminals and deserters. They were often thrown unarmed to wild animals or forced to fight to the death against trained gladiators, or even other condemned men, in gruesome one-sided spectacles that left no room for heroism. This was a public display of power, a stark reminder of the consequences of defying Rome, and the gladiatorial combat. It was a meticulously orchestrated show of controlled violence. Different gladiator types, like the heavily armed Murmillo and the agile Retiarius with his net and trident, were pitted against each other to create dramatic contrasts. But the goal was often simple: bloodshed. When a gladiator fell, his fate was often decided by the crowd, with a thumbs up or down from the emperor. If allowed to live, he was rare. If killed, his body would be dragged away, and the sand raked clean for the next act of terror. The psychology of the crowd is perhaps the most disturbing aspect. They reveled in the violence. They cheered for death. They were not merely spectators. They were active participants in a ritual of dehumanization. For the Roman citizen, watching a man die a brutal death was a form of catharsis, a release of primal urges, and a reaffirmation of their own status and superiority over the doomed combatants. It was a terrifying glimpse into the human capacity for cruelty, elevated to a national pastime. So, while Hollywood gives us a hero fighting for freedom, the real Colosseum was a monstrous testament to the power of the state to wield death as entertainment, a place where emperors like Commodus could indulge their darkest fantasies, surrounded by a roaring crowd hungry for blood. The hero of the film never truly experienced the full, unvarnished horror of what it meant to fight and die inside the real arena. As Commodus's reign progressed, his descent into madness accelerated. His obsession with the arena became more pronounced, eclipsing all duties of state. He moved into the gladiatorial barracks, living among the gladiators, even taking a gladiator, Narcissus, as his personal wrestling partner and confidant. This wasn't just eccentric, it was a profound insult to the Roman ruling class, who saw their emperor debasing the highest office in the world. From a psychological perspective, Commodus was not merely a tyrant. He was a performance artist of power, constantly seeking to shock, dominate, and provoke a reaction. He relished public humiliation, particularly of the Senate. He would force senators to watch his gladiatorial victories, even making them wear tunics that identified them as gladiators themselves. He would kill exotic animals with skill, then present the severed heads to the senators, as if mocking their impotence. His behavior wasn't just cruel. It was psychologically calculated to assert absolute, terrifying control over every aspect of Roman life. The breaking point arrived when Commodus declared his intention to rename Rome Colonia Commodiana, and planned to officially debut his new Rome on January 1st, 193 AD, but he wouldn't arrive as an emperor. He planned to march into the city, not in a royal toga, but dressed as a gladiator, carrying a club, ready to perform a gladiatorial bout on New Year's Day. For the Roman elite, this was the ultimate sacrilege, a final, unbearable humiliation. The dread had become too profound. This level of instability inevitably led to a conspiracy. The movie Gladiator ends with Maximus finally confronting Commodus in the arena. The real conspiracy was far less heroic, and much more typical of Roman political intrigue. The plot was led by his own mistress, Marcia, his chamberlain Eclectus, and the Praetorian prefect Latesta, very people closest to him, who had become terrified for their own lives. Their plan was simple: poison him. On December 31st, 192 AD, Marcia offered Commodus poisoned wine. However, the poison was not strong enough, or perhaps Commodus, accustomed to excess, had built up a tolerance. He vomited the poison but became violently ill. Realizing their plot had failed, and fearing Commodus's inevitable, brutal revenge, the conspirators quickly moved to their backup plan. They hired his wrestling partner, the gladiator Narcissus, to finish the job. Commodus was found in his bath, allegedly strangled to death by Narcissus. The official cause of death was given as apoplexy, a sudden stroke, to avoid public scandal. But the true story was whispered throughout Rome. The narcissistic emperor, who had lived and breathed the arena, was ultimately brought down, not by a heroic general, but by the very gladiator he believed he controlled. The death of Commodus plunged Rome into a period of chaos, ushering in the year of the 5 emperors. But his bizarre and brutal reign serves as a chilling psychological autopsy, a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, absolute narcissism, and the terrifying truth that sometimes the greatest monster in history wears a crown. And so, the true, brutal story behind Gladiator is revealed. The reality of ancient Rome, and the emperor who ruled it, was far more complex, more depraved, and in many ways, more psychologically unsettling than anything Hollywood dared to show. The noble general Maximus is a fictional hero, a composite of various Roman figures, created to give us a protagonist to root for. The real Emperor Commodus was not merely a jealous brother, but a full-blown narcissistic megalomaniac, who saw himself as a living god and a gladiator. So, why did Hollywood choose to change so much? From a psychological perspective, the answer lies in the fundamental difference between history and storytelling. History is messy, contradictory, and often deeply unsettling. It lacks clear heroes and villains, and its endings are rarely clean or satisfying. Hollywood, on the other hand, understands the anatomy of a myth. It recognizes our innate human need for a compelling narrative. We crave stories of justice, of good triumphing over evil, of heroes who fight for what is right. The dread of the real Commodus, unpredictable, childish tyrant, is too random, too chaotic, and ultimately, too depressing for a blockbuster film. The dread of the real Colosseum, the systematic slaughter of the dehumanized, is too brutal for a mass audience. So, the film Gladiator meticulously crafted a myth. It gave us a heroic general whose family was murdered, providing a clear motive for vengeance. It gave us a Commodus who was evil but understandable, allowing us to hate him without being completely repulsed. It gave us a climactic battle in the arena where good finally confronts evil, providing a cathartic release. It transformed the raw, brutal facts of history into a psychologically satisfying narrative. But in doing so, it smoothed out the rough edges of truth. It replaced the complex, often unheroic reality of Roman politics and violence with a simplified, emotionally resonant tale. The real history of Commodus, a man who believed himself to be Hercules but was choked in a bath by his wrestling partner. The real gladiators, who were enslaved and died anonymously for the entertainment of the masses. These stories were deemed too brutal or too bizarre for the silver screen. And this is the final, chilling lesson from our investigation. The film Gladiator reminds us that the most powerful stories are often the ones that reshape history, not just reflect it. It teaches us about the anatomy of a hero, and the necessary lies we sometimes tell ourselves to make the past more palatable, more inspiring, and ultimately, more entertaining. The truth, as always, is far more complex, far less glamorous, and far, far more brutal. And so, the final investigation is now passed to you. After dissecting the history and the Hollywood myth, what do you believe is the most important psychological difference between the fictional gladiator and the terrifying reality of ancient Rome? Leave your analysis in the comments below. Let us continue the discussion about the thin line between historical truth and the powerful legends we choose to believe.